Welcome to Spot Check, the weekly update series for The Greatest Unreality, a dissertation about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm Nick Miser. As you can see, I have returned safely from my trip to New York and Connecticut, followed by a short stay in Chicago for the American Anthropological Association conference. I'm still processing and transcribing through all of the data that I gathered in New York. It was a very productive trip. I did 13 interviews and game session recordings. I'm still working my way through all of those. So I'm going to be kind of shifting gears a little bit here on these videos. Up until this point, I've been talking in more processed terms of things that I've thought through. It's a lot of that I've been talking about in recent weeks actually comes from a paper that I'm working on, which I hope to be able to post online pretty soon for you guys to look at and get more detail if you found any of those topics interesting. But I'll also be doing videos like this where I'm more just kind of relating to you what's been going on in the field work, and I may talk about some of the ideas that have been coming up, but they're going to be a lot more raw, and that's what we talked about in the Kickstarter, is that in these videos you're kind of coming along with me on this process. So in New York, I followed the methodology that I have of taking one contact, in this case Tavis, who I've talked about before. I met at GaryCon, following him back to his home gaming scene, which in this case is New York City, and then just sort of following, we call it snowball sampling in anthropology, where you just kind of follow the social connections outward of asking each person you interview who else might be good to talk to. And so in that process, I talked to a number of different kind of overlapping circles of people in New York. There was the New York Redbox group, who I interviewed or did some interviews with, and had an opening game session. When my first night there was their 200th session of their campaign. They've been playing basic D&D for about 4 years now together, and there was also a gaming group that is playing, at least in the game that I observed, they're playing a variant of Pathfinder infused with a lot of story game type mechanics. And I'll talk more about that once I get to being able to process through their interviews and transcripts of what that was like. And then in the final interviews that I did, kind of the farthest circle from that initial point of contact was a group strongly connected with Nerd NYC, which is a big organization in New York that connects a lot of different sort of geek-related activities, board gaming, role-playing, obviously, and a number of other things. Separate from the New York trip, I went up to Connecticut, as I mentioned, and worked with a group that they call their campaign Fond of Justice. It's the name of their adventuring company in the game. And that's a campaign where they're playing mostly AD&D First Edition, and they've been going for about 18 years. And I mentioned that in one of the previous videos. So there's a lot of insights and things that they've built up over time that I'll get around to talking about. And now the thing that I noticed is that each of these groups approached gaming differently. The relationship between story and rules, the things that they were getting out of it, the type of social relationships that were surrounding the play that they had. And there are obviously overlaps, and especially with the New York groups, there's these overlapping circles where they're thinking about some of the same ideas and having some of the same approaches and concerns about gaming because they are in somewhat overlapping social networks. But I did notice that in Connecticut, a lot of the discussions that they have are very different because of the different social connections and different historical development of the gameplay in that area. So as I start to get a handle on that, I'll talk more about it. What I'm going to do today, though, is just give a little bit of a vignette of one of the interviews that I did with someone from the Glantry campaign, which is the New York Redbox group that I was in on their 200th session. And so as I said, I got right off the airplane, and the first night that I was there, I went to their 200th session of this campaign, and I still had my luggage with me and was lugging it all around central Manhattan. But I went, they meet at a place called Cafe 28, and for those of you who, like me, are not New Yorkers, you might not be familiar with this type of place that they play in. It's sort of a 24-hour cafe, 7-Eleven sort of place with all kinds of different food and alcohol, but they always have these seating areas, often in the upstairs part. And this is where the game took place. And there were a couple other people playing various games in that cafe too. So there was a group playing Burning Wheel. I think some people were playing GURPS at another table. So it's kind of a place where gamers tend to gather together in Manhattan. I sat in on the session and got to talk to some of the people there. A few of them were able to do interviews while I was in New York. And so the person I want to talk about today is Eric. And Eric agreed to an interview. We met a few days after that at a German-style pub in Brooklyn. Now, Eric, if you to picture him, he's a rugby player, kind of a big guy. Showed up to the interview wearing a Captain America shirt and I think a Yankees cap. And he works in IT, but he started out in archaeology, was his college degree, so we had some shared ground there. And he was introduced to gaming through his dad is a librarian, and when he was about 7 years old, a friend of his dad's had a kid who was a few years older. Eric was 7 and this guy was 10, and they start playing Keep on the Borderlands, and Eric's just allowed to watch at this point, but he said it made a really strong impression on him, and some of the illustrations and things that happen in the game are images that stick with him to this day. He's gamed pretty much continuously since then, although for a while he was doing mostly LARP instead of tabletop. And now Eric describes himself as a stick jockey, which is a term from LARP, meaning that he tends to like the combat side of things more than sort of sitting around and I think he called it kind of brooding and talking about your emotions. So this might give you the impression of like a meathead kind of jock guy who just wants to hit stuff and doesn't really think about what he's doing. But one of the awesome things that I'm able to find in my field work, and that I hope to have as a recurring theme that I can talk about with you all, is that those images aren't necessarily accurate. Eric definitely likes hitting stuff when he games, and he talks about a session where they're just mapping in the dungeon as kind of boring to him, but he comes for the social connections. But also in our conversation, he had a lot of great reflections on his experiences gaming, and so just because in a lot of kind of casual talk we have about role-playing games, there's this assumption that there's people who like just play combat and it's hack and slash and there's not much going on there, or there's people who really like role-playing and deep immersive sort of activities, and that those are the more kind of the higher art form where there's more interesting things going on. And what I found is that there's interesting things going on all over that spectrum, and to even divide it that way is problematic. But today I'll talk a little bit about, share a little bit of conversation that we had about visualization. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to get at in these interviews and in my research is trying to understand the experience of play and think about what are we actually directing our attention towards, how are we experiencing the imagined spaces that we're dealing with, how are we experiencing the stories that emerge, how we're experiencing the characters, the other people. There's a lot going on in any given game session, and where are we directing our attention and how are we building up that kind of comprehensive experience. And on a theoretical side, what I'm drawing on is a tradition of philosophy that's made its way into other disciplines as well, called phenomenology. And I will probably in the future dedicate a video to trying to boil down some of the essentials of phenomenology and what that means for my study and what I'm able and hoping to get at. But for this conversation, I'll just say that we're talking about with Eric how he visualizes or doesn't visualize the spaces of play as they're going into a dungeon. So I asked him, if you walk into a new room in the dungeon that you've never been to before, are you picturing that in your head? Are you thinking of it abstractly? Because we have a lot of assumptions about how people experience that, and it's not necessarily always the same for everybody. So in Eric's case, he said that he can visualize those things, and when he's reading, he really does picture that really vividly in sort of a cinematic way, but that in gaming, he's not necessarily doing that all of the time, which I think would come as a surprise to some people, especially people who don't game at all, or if you're the kind of gamer who does that all the time, to find out that not everyone is doing that all the time might be a revelation. And so what Eric said is that it takes an extra effort of the will to kind of conjure up that imaginative vision in his head, but that when he's playing a game, a lot of what he's trying to do is pay attention very carefully to what the dungeon master is saying, the descriptions that are being given, so that he can build on those and interact and move the story forward and find out kind of interesting things that the DM might be hinting at in the world that he would miss if he takes that extra step to visualize. And so it's a thing that he'll do from time to time rather than always. And so he talked about a specific case where they were going to a demon temple on the 5th level of this massive mega dungeon they have in their campaign. I think there are over 1,000 rooms and 13 levels. So it's a massive creative undertaking that the dungeon master has put together. But they went into this demon temple, and he said, I don't think that I really visualized it at the time. And he stopped and reflected and kind of started describing the temple to me in that moment. And he said, yeah, no, I know that I didn't visualize it because I'm visualizing it now. And if I had been visualizing it at the time, I would have said, we need to get out of here. And that prompted him to reflect on the way that when he's actively visualizing the game, how that changes the relationship that he's experiencing between himself and the character. In the visualization, he described it as sort of losing the character a little bit and getting immersed to the point where he's no longer the player character because he's visualizing himself there. And that makes the role-playing aspect of it a little bit more difficult because, as Eric said, in old school D&D, you're playing what he described as mentally unstable people, because who would go 5 levels underground and explore a demon temple except for someone who's a little bit unbalanced? And so there's a way in which the immersion, he can get kind of caught up in that, and it precludes achieving other goals of play. So immersion in the visual sense is only one of the things that people are pursuing when they play the game, and there's lots of other aspects that have to be balanced against that. So I guess that's part of the takeaway from that little bit of Eric's conversation, is that even in our imaginative processes as we're engaging the game, we're using strategies to balance out a lot of different goals that we have, a lot of different goals that the other players have, and that those aren't always able to be realized to the same extent at the same time. And so you're going to be deploying different strategies at different times. And that's where, as I'm analyzing these game sessions going forward, I want to pay attention to what's going on at various moments in the game and over the course of the session, and what things are being foregrounded and backgrounded. And I feel that there's going to be a lot of valuable insights to how we're interacting with fictional worlds by looking at those things. Because other people that I talked to said that they don't even visualize the game vividly at all, even though maybe when they're reading they do, but they interact with the world in a more abstract kind of problem-solving oriented way. And so I won't get into that because I'm not talking about those interviews here today, but that's just one little nugget of data that I'm trying to work through and piece together. So I'd like to hear your thoughts too on if you're watching this and you're a gamer, how do you interact with the gaming world? What experiences do you foreground or push to the background as you're playing? To what extent are you actively visualizing the events that are happening, the places that you're in? And if you use mapping or miniatures, how does that change your interaction with the imaginary spaces? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Any comments you have about what I've been doing so far or things that I've brought up. I want this to be as interactive of a process as possible. And I'm going to keep plugging away at these transcriptions and have more to talk to you about next week. I'll see you then.